If you've ever opened your electricity bill in the middle of summer and felt that quiet frustration creeping in, you're not alone. Every year, millions of people pay hundreds of dollars just to keep their homes from turning into ovens, believing there is no other choice. But what if that belief isn't entirely true? What if the system you rely on, the one that hums quietly in the background of your life, isn't the only way to stay cool, but simply the most heavily promoted one? There is a nearly forgotten method of cooling that costs almost nothing to operate, requires no complex machinery, and has been quietly pushed aside by an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. An industry that didn't just sell machines, but reshaped how entire generations think about comfort, necessity, and survival in heat. And once you understand what was left behind, and more importantly, why it was left behind, it will fundamentally change the way you see something as simple as cooling your own home. Most people never stop to consider just how massive this dependence has become. Right now, there are over 2 billion air conditioning units running across the world, quietly consuming nearly 10% of all global electricity. In the United States alone, cooling accounts for a significant portion of household energy use every summer, driving up both costs and demand on an already strained grid. And this isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. By 2030, that number is expected to more than double, reaching over 5 billion units worldwide. To sustain that level of cooling, the world would need to generate an amount of electricity comparable to the combined output of the United States, Europe, and Japan. This isn't just about comfort anymore. It's about a rapidly growing system that is scaling faster than the infrastructure designed to support it. As demand continues to surge toward that 2030 reality, the pressure on global energy systems becomes impossible to ignore. Power grids in many regions are already struggling during peak summer heat, with blackouts becoming more frequent as millions of units switch on at the same time. The more temperatures rise, the more people depend on air conditioning, and the more fragile the entire system becomes. This creates a dangerous dependency where staying cool is no longer a convenience, but a necessity tied directly to access to electricity. And if that supply falters, even briefly, the consequences are immediate and severe, especially for those who have no alternative way to cope with extreme heat. But what if staying cool didn't have to depend on a fragile grid, expensive machines, or chemical refrigerants at all? What if there were a way to lower the temperature inside your home using almost no energy, no compressor, and no complex system constantly running in the background? A method so simple that once it's built, it can operate at a cost so low it's almost negligible. It doesn't rely on hidden components or advanced technology, and it doesn't need to be plugged into anything to work. And yet, this isn't some new invention waiting to be discovered. It's something people already understood, used, and relied on long before modern air conditioning ever existed. To understand how this works, you don't need a background in physics, you just need to think about what your own body does on a hot day. When your skin gets wet with sweat and a breeze passes over it, you feel cooler, even if the air itself is still warm. That cooling effect isn't coming from the water sitting on your skin, but from what happens when that water begins to disappear. As it evaporates, it draws heat away from your body, carrying that energy into the air. It's a quiet, invisible exchange that happens constantly, and it's incredibly powerful. The same process can be used to cool air before it ever enters a room. When warm, dry air passes through a damp surface, the water begins to evaporate, and in doing so, it pulls heat out of the air itself. The result is air that feels noticeably cooler without needing any complex machinery to force the change. It's not artificial cooling. It's simply working with the natural behavior of water and heat, the same interaction your body has relied on your entire life. Long before modern air conditioning became a household standard, people living in some of the harshest climates on Earth had already figured this out through necessity. In the early 1920s, families in the deserts of the American Southwest faced relentless summer heat with no access to electricity, no refrigeration, and no machines to fall back on. Temperatures regularly climbed to levels that made indoor spaces almost unbearable. Yet they still found a way to make their homes livable. Using simple materials like wood, fabric, and water, they built basic cooling structures that anyone could assemble. They would stretch porous fibers across a frame, keep them soaked with water, and position them where air could pass through. As the dry desert wind moved across the damp surface, the same process that cooled human skin began to cool the air itself. These early systems didn't rely on technology in the modern sense. They relied on observation, adaptation, and a deep understanding of how to work with the environment rather than fight against it. What makes this even more compelling is that these desert communities were not discovering something new, they were rediscovering something ancient. Thousands of years earlier, civilizations in completely different parts of the world had already been using the same principle. In ancient Egypt, people hung wet reeds or cloth in windows and doorways to cool the air as it entered their homes. In Persia, architects designed towering structures that captured wind and directed it down through water-cooled channels, lowering temperatures naturally inside buildings. In parts of India, woven grass screens soaked in water were placed in front of openings, allowing passing air to be cooled before reaching living spaces. These cultures had no connection to one another in terms of technology, yet they arrived at the same solution. Not because it was taught, but because it worked. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, that shared understanding began to disappear. As mechanical air conditioning became more affordable after World War II, companies led by pioneers like Willis Carrier transformed cooling from a practical solution into a product. But they didn't just introduce a new technology, they reshaped how people thought about comfort itself. Through aggressive marketing and rapid industrial expansion, air conditioning was positioned not as one option among many, but as the only modern, reliable way to stay cool. At the same time, older methods were quietly pushed aside, labeled as outdated, ineffective, or even a sign that you couldn't afford something better. Over time, entire regions that had relied on simple, efficient cooling for decades abandoned it, not because it stopped working, but because perception had changed. What once was seen as ingenuity became something people were taught to overlook. This is where the story shifts in a way most people never question. What replaced those older methods wasn't necessarily a better solution in every situation. It was a more marketable one. In many dry climates, the original approach was cheaper, simpler, and far more energy efficient. Yet it lost ground because it didn't fit the image of modern living that companies were selling. The real change wasn't in the physics of cooling, but in perception. People didn't abandon what worked because it failed, they abandoned it because they were convinced something else was superior. The consequences of that shift are now unfolding on a global scale, and they reach far beyond a higher monthly bill. Air conditioning has become one of the largest drivers of electricity demand during peak summer months, pushing power grids to their limits and increasing the risk of outages when temperatures are at their most dangerous. Entire cities now depend on a continuous flow of energy just to remain livable for a few hours each day. At the same time, the systems designed to cool us are quietly contributing to the very heat they are meant to escape. Most conventional units rely on refrigerants that carry a heavy environmental cost. And as these systems age, small leaks release gases into the atmosphere that trap heat far more effectively than carbon dioxide. Layered on top of that is the massive energy consumption required to run billions of machines simultaneously, much of it still powered by fossil fuels. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle. The hotter the planet becomes, the more we rely on air conditioning, and the more we rely on it, the faster we accelerate the warming itself. What began as a solution has slowly become part of the problem, and most people are caught inside that loop without ever realizing it. But this is where the story needs to stay honest, because no solution works everywhere. The same process that makes this method so effective in dry climates becomes its biggest limitation in places where the air is already heavy with moisture. When humidity is high, water can't evaporate as easily, which means it can't pull heat out of the air efficiently. In those environments, the cooling effect drops significantly, and in some cases, it can even make indoor conditions feel more uncomfortable by adding more moisture to the air. This is why regions with consistently high humidity moved away from these systems. They simply weren't the right fit. The key isn't that one method is universally better, but that different environments require different approaches. But this is exactly where modern innovation begins to change the equation. Instead of abandoning the principle altogether, engineers started asking a different question. What if you could keep the cooling effect of evaporation without adding moisture to the air? That idea led to the development of indirect evaporative cooling, a design that separates the process of evaporation from the air that actually enters the room. In this system, water still evaporates and absorbs heat, but it does so in a separate channel, cooling a surface that incoming air passes over without ever picking up additional humidity. The result is air that feels cooler and remains dry, solving the very problem that limited earlier designs. This approach doesn't replace the original idea, it refines it. It takes a simple, natural process and adapts it to fit a wider range of environments, opening the door for a new generation of cooling systems that are both efficient and far less dependent on energy-intensive technology. This isn't just a theoretical improvement, it's already being applied in the real world. Companies like Sealy International have developed commercial systems based on indirect evaporative cooling that are now installed in offices, warehouses, and residential buildings across multiple continents. Independent studies and field tests have shown that these systems can reduce energy consumption by as much as 60 to 80% compared to conventional air conditioning, while still maintaining comfortable indoor temperatures. At the same time, research institutions such as National Renewable Energy Laboratory have published analyses indicating that this approach could meet the cooling needs of a significant portion of the global population. What was once considered outdated is now being re-engineered into something highly practical, backed not just by theory, but by measurable results. At the same time, far from research labs and commercial systems, a much simpler version of this idea has been quietly transforming lives in places where electricity is unreliable or completely absent. In parts of West Africa, a device known as the Zeer pot uses nothing more than clay, sand, water, and air to keep food cool for days or even weeks. It consists of one clay pot placed inside another, with wet sand packed between them, and a damp cloth covering the top. As water slowly evaporates from the outer surface, it draws heat away from the inner chamber, lowering the temperature enough to preserve fruits, vegetables, and other perishable goods. For many families, this isn't just a clever trick, it's a shift in daily life. Food lasts longer, waste is reduced, and the need to travel long distances to sell or replace spoiled goods decreases. In some communities, it has even allowed children, especially girls, to spend more time in school, instead of helping manage food that would otherwise spoil within hours. It's a reminder that cooling, in its simplest form, can be more than comfort. It can be stability, opportunity, and time. What makes this even more significant is the sheer number of people living in environments where this approach is not just viable, but highly effective. Across regions like North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, large parts of India, and the American Southwest, well over 2 billion people live in hot, dry climates where evaporation-based cooling performs at its best. These are places where temperatures can become extreme, yet humidity remains low enough for this natural process to work efficiently. And yet, despite being perfectly suited for these conditions, many of these regions have increasingly adopted energy-intensive systems that were never designed with their environment in mind, often at a much higher cost both financially and environmentally. There is, however, another layer to this story that can't be ignored. The very element that makes this form of cooling possible, water, is becoming increasingly scarce in many of the same regions where it works best. Traditional evaporative systems can consume a noticeable amount of water over time, which raises a valid concern in areas already facing drought and limited resources. But this is where innovation is beginning to close the gap. New designs are being developed to recycle water within closed systems, dramatically reducing waste, while advanced materials are being engineered to capture moisture from the air itself and reuse it during the cooling process. What once seemed like a limitation is now becoming another problem that science is learning how to solve. Looking ahead, the most promising direction isn't just improving efficiency, but removing dependence altogether. Because evaporative systems require so little energy to operate, they can be paired with small-scale solar power, making it possible to cool a space without relying on a centralized grid at all. This opens the door to off-grid solutions that can function in remote areas, informal settlements, or regions where infrastructure is unreliable. In practical terms, it means a single solar panel can power a system capable of maintaining livable indoor temperatures even under extreme heat. For communities that have never had consistent access to cooling, this isn't just an upgrade, it represents an entirely new level of independence. At its core, this story isn't really about machines at all. It's about something far more fundamental, the quiet, invisible rules that govern how the world works. Long before compressors, circuits, or manufactured systems, cooling existed as a simple interaction between water, air, and heat. What we often see as advanced technology is, in many cases, just a complex way of replicating what nature already does effortlessly. The real power here doesn't come from invention, but from understanding. Because sometimes, the most effective solution isn't something we build, it's something we learn to work with. The next time you hear that familiar hum of your air conditioner turning on, or feel the hesitation before adjusting the thermostat because you know what it might cost, it's worth pausing for a moment. Not just to think about the temperature in your home, but about the assumptions behind how you choose to stay cool. Because comfort, as it turns out, has never been defined by a single machine. It has always been shaped by what we believe is possible. Before you accept that higher bills and constant dependence are the only way to survive the heat, take a moment to question it. Look closer, think differently, and consider what alternatives might already exist around you. And if this changed the way you see something as ordinary as staying cool, share it, because someone else might still be living inside a belief they've never thought to challenge.